Good morning. I'm George Dean, the President and CEO of the Greater Phoenix Urban League, a leading provider of human services in the Valley, and you are watching Urban Connections. For those of you who might be tuning in for the first time, you need to know that Urban Connections came about through an agreement with Channel 3 and the Greater Phoenix Urban League that we would bring you a program at least once each month to talk about various issues, situations, concerns, conditions, and so forth that are taking place not only here locally, but statewide and indeed nationwide. And today, that is indeed what we're going to do. We're going to have a subject matter and a guest that has been on Urban Connections before, but we're going to talk about something that is very important and something that's been in the news a lot lately, and that is education funding. Education funding in the state of Arizona. You know that that's a hot topic and one that has been discussed over and over and over and over and over again. And I don't know that we have a solution yet, but at least we're going to talk about it and also let you know how you can become involved in this process as well. So stay tuned. We'll be back. Welcome back. I'm George Dean, the President and CEO of the Greater Phoenix Urban League, a leading provider of human services in the Valley. You're watching Urban Connections, and I'm very, very pleased to have as my guest this morning Mr. Tim Hogan, the Executive Director of the Arizona Center for Law and the Public Interest. And Tim, let me say welcome again to Urban Connections.
Thanks, George. Good to see you.
Seems like we do this at least once a year that we
And we haven't
come
solved
on
any
with,
problems yet.
But just for those persons who might not be familiar with the Arizona Center for Law and the Public Interest, give us a thumbnail sketch of what it's about, first
Sure.
of all.
We're a nonprofit public interest law firm charitable organization under the Internal Revenue Code.
Okay.
We were established in 1974 to try and use the courts, litigation, to address statewide problems that affect everybody.
Okay.
So over the years, we've done school finance litigation, clean air litigation, litigation on public health issues. We're currently involved in the Medicaid expansion case that legislators filed. You know, we try and identify cases that are going to impact Arizonans in a positive way and make this a better place to live.
Okay. Okay. And one of those litigations, well, not one, probably several by now, of those litigations has been school funding.
Right.
Let's, you know, and we've, in the last month, 2 months or so forth, we've heard a lot about it. Well, first of all, when the governor came in and they passed the budget and they cut school funding and cut the universities and took the community colleges completely out of it. But K-12 is what we're most interested in here with this. And I know you filed a suit many years ago about English immersion and all of these kind of things. How does school funding really operates here in the state of Arizona? What's the basis of it?
Well, people will tell you it's the most complicated system they've ever seen, but it's at its most elemental form. It's pretty simple to understand. There's something called a base level dollar figure per student for K-12 education.
Okay.
Right now it's about $3,500 per student. You multiply that times the number of students you have, and that tells a school district how many dollars they have to spend in any given year.
Okay.
Now it gets real complicated because you weight students differently for high school students and for elementary students, special ed students, English language learners.
Okay.
But that's basically how the system is set up. And so it limits school districts in how much they can spend, subject to some exceptions, like doing overrides. That's why a district can ask their voters to exceed that amount, that spending amount, by 10% if the voters approve it. So that's how you get overrides, as an exception to this spending limit.
So how did that leave us? I mean, everything says that Arizona is number 50 when it comes to the amount of money we spend per student and so forth. How did our base level put us the worst in the country?
Right.
I mean, the lowest in the country, I should
Well, the
say.
problem is this, essentially the base level that we're using today is the same base level that we used in 1980, 35 years ago.
Oh, wow.
Now, it's been inflated somewhat over that period of time, but it obviously hasn't kept up with the costs of educating children.
Okay.
And so over that period of time, at one time, way back when, after 1980, we weren't 50th in the country. We were, 25th or somewhere in the middle.
Okay.
But over that period of time, we have gradually gone down, down, down to where we're at the bottom at this point, because we haven't kept up with the costs of educating kids. We haven't kept up with teachers' salaries. So that amount hasn't grown enough, that base level amount hasn't grown enough to support the kind of funding I think most of us want to see in our schools.
Now, is this all spearheaded by the legislature and the governor, or is it on one branch, the governor's side or the legislative side? Where does it all stem from? The superintendent of public instruction, where do they come from?
Yeah, I mean, the governor and the superintendent of public instruction can't pass laws and they can't pass budgets.
Okay.
The legislature has to do that.
Okay.
So every year the legislature has a budget, and if, theoretically, I suppose, if the governor doesn't like the budget, he or she could veto it, meaning we're not going to spend anything on state services, and government would shut down. That hasn't happened.
Okay.
Not in Arizona. It's happened nationally, but it hasn't happened in Arizona. So it's really the legislature where this starts, through the budget process. enacting a budget every year, and then the taxation system. You know, the legislature decides who gets taxed and how much. And over the last 20 years, we've seen annual tax decreases implemented by the legislature, which means the pot of money that we have to fund education with has shrunk.
Okay.
And so that's where we're really at. And of course, we had, you know, the recession and things like that, which have hurt state revenues. But that's not really the issue here. The issue has been a constant series of tax reductions over a long period of time that have eroded state revenues to the point where the legislature says it can't afford to do any of these things.
Okay.
And of course, the reason it can't afford to do any of these things is because it doesn't want to generate the money to do them.
To do it, and they've also said no raising and no tax raises.
No tax. Well, the governor has most famously said, you know, not on his watch.
Yeah.
No, and that's why you see the governor in the current situation wanting to get revenues for education out of the trust fund.
Okay. Tim, we've got to take a short break. We're going to come back and discuss this some more. Stay tuned. We'll be back. Welcome back. I'm George Dean, President and CEO of the Greater Phoenix Urban League, a leading provider of human services in the Valley. Talking this morning with Tim Hogan, the Executive Director of the Arizona Center for Law and the Public Interest. And we've been talking about school funding. In fact, in that first segment, Tim laid out really how funding comes about and base level, and the fact that the governor and well, not the governor, but the legislature has to starts the process and make it happen and so forth. And Tim, right now there are 3.5, I guess, if not 4 plans that are out there. The governor has a plan for funding education. The Republican legislators have a plan. The Democrats a few days ago came out with a plan. And the superintendent of public instruction, Diane Douglas, also says that she has a plan. Well, not really a plan, I say 3.5, but she did say spend some money.
Right.
You know, so where are we with this?
Well, I mean, this is happening for a couple of reasons. I mean, we haven't talked about it yet, but we filed a lawsuit on behalf of school groups back in 2010 to require the legislature to comply with a law that was approved by Arizona voters back in 2000.
Right.
To annually inflate that base level we were talking about by 2% or the actual level of inflation, whichever was less. And so when we got to the recession a few years ago, back in 2008, 2009, the legislature decided it wasn't going to fund that anymore. And then, even more recently, it decided it wasn't going to fund the full amount. And so we brought a lawsuit in 2009 originally, and then again in 2010 to require the legislature to provide that funding.
Okay.
That would be about, and this case has gone to the state Supreme Court, and now it's gone back to the trial court. There's a judgment requiring the state to provide, going forward on this base level amount, about $250 million more a year to provide money for this inflation.
Right.
And there's the issue pending about how much they owe for what they didn't pay in the past. And so the legislature and the governor are feeling pressure from the courts and from our litigation to come up with a way to fund that. And of course, at the same time this has happened, it's no coincidence, we've dropped to 50th in the country
Right.
in spending per pupil. Teacher salaries were among the lowest
in the
three
country.
states in the, I guess, with West Virginia and someplace else.
Right.
We're the poorest state for a teacher to work in.
Okay.
I mean, teachers are leaving.
And teachers are leaving, right.
We've got large class size. I mean, and so there's been this enormous public pressure coupled with this lawsuit requiring them to pay the money that has forced, really, the governor, the legislature, the superintendent of public instruction to start coming up with plans to do something. Because otherwise, I think they're concerned, and rightly so, voters are going to start to hold them accountable for their failures.
Okay. Well, I mean, the Arizona Center for Law and Public Interest have been very successful in terms of taking it to the courts and so forth. I don't know, it might say something about the law system itself, and I know you're a lawyer, but gee whiz, you guys can take things and drag it on and on and on and
Well,
on.
yeah, that's not my preference for dragging any of this on, but
Yeah.
but the court system, I mean, we've got a good court system in Arizona compared to a lot of other places. It's one of the bright spots, actually.
Okay.
And actually, the case has moved pretty quickly, for processing through the court system. We've
Okay.
gone through 4 different court levels now, and we're poised to finish this up. And I think that's why we're seeing some of these plans now to try and cut off further court judgments about what should happen here.
Okay. Why? I know that there must be associations of superintendents. There's probably National Teachers Association, Education Association, and so forth. I guess I'm finding it hard to understand why our legislators don't listen to the folks that's in the field, that's knowing what it takes to educate our children and so forth.
Well, it's a
And holding
complicated,
back on the money.
Yeah, it's a complicated question, but it's driven by the money.
Okay.
The legislature, I mean, this has been a statewide strategy with the legislature and our governors over the last 20 years to reduce taxes in Arizona in the hope that that's going to attract more businesses and generate more economic activity and prosperity for everybody. It hasn't worked out.
Right.
I mean, we've
Right.
done it for 20
Right.
years, and
Right.
the
It's time to
notion
change.
the notion that we just have to do it 1 or 2 more years and somehow it'll materialize just doesn't strike me as sane.
Right. Right.
But that's really what's been driving the education discussion, as it drives so many other discussions at the legislature, is money. Along with that is the notion at the legislature, some at the legislature wanted a long time ago to introduce competition for public schools through charter schools and through private schools. So we've seen money being diverted to charter schools and private schools through tuition tax credits, through vouchers, things like that. And so the theory there was that, well, if there's competition, this is like a business.
Okay.
We're going to run this like a business. We're going to introduce competition. The schools had a monopoly. The public schools had a monopoly. We're going to make it competitive, and then everybody's going to get better. Well, that hasn't worked out either. So, we're at the end of those experiments, it
Okay.
seems to me.
Tim, we got to take another break, and we'll come back and we'll wrap up this conversation. But school funding in Arizona, something we got to work on. Stay tuned. We'll be back. Welcome back. I'm George Dean, President and CEO of the Greater Phoenix Urban League, a leading provider of human services in the Valley. You're watching Urban Connections, and hopefully you are not just tuning in, because if you are just tuning in, you've missed a very lively discussion that we've had with Tim Hogan, the Executive Director of the Arizona Center for Law and the Public Interest. And what we've really been talking about is school funding and school funding for K through 12 in the state of Arizona, which is something that is so very important. We are the worst in the country when it comes to spending per student funding and so forth, and there's a reason for that, but we also have teachers leaving the state in droves and so forth. In fact, there are a lot of school districts that don't have enough teachers and looking for teachers and going out trying to recruit teachers, and people are not wanting to come to Arizona. And we all know that Arizona is a great place to be, but we got to do something about that education system. Now, in regards to that, I mentioned earlier the fact that the governor has a plan, the Republican legislators have a plan, the Democratic legislators have a plan, and the superintendent of public instruction has a half plan and so forth. So we got 3.5 plans and so forth. What's your thought on those, Tim?
Well, yeah, let's be clear about what these plans are about, though.
Okay.
First of all, most of the plans are aimed at taking care of the court litigation.
Okay.
The amount that they're supposed to fund for inflation, both going forward and the amount they didn't pay in the past. We've been talking about huge problems in the education system, not just this inflation problem. I mean,
right.
That's a problem, and solving it will add some funding to the system, but it's not going to turn the system around.
Okay.
And so as a result, I mean, you're talking about having to come up with, at least this year, for example, $250 million more to satisfy the inflation problem that the courts have identified through our litigation. Well, so none of the plans require any tax increases of any kind, right?
Okay.
Because it's pretty narrowly focused on this inflation issue. The governor's plan, and to some extent the legislature's plan, involves taking money from the state land trust, which provides some funding to education every year. And that's what the purpose was when Arizona became a state back in 1912. We got all this land from the federal government to be held in trust for education. And so it's built up over the years. Well, the governor and the legislature want to start taking more money out of that to fund this problem that we've got right now. And the other plan, the Democrats' plan, wants to take the surplus that we're actually operating at a surplus now in the state. We have a $275 million surplus, plus a rainy day fund. And you could argue this rainy day fund of $475 million was funded by failing to comply with the law and fund inflation. So that plan says, let's spend those. The superintendent just says, let's spend $400 million. I don't know that she's proposed any particular way to come up with that. So you've got these plans out there, but again, there are discussions going on about, potentially resolving this litigation with elements from one or more of those plans. But again, let's not kid ourselves about education funding here. Even if we get that resolved, we've still got huge problems with education funding in Arizona.
Okay. Tim, we're just about running out of time here. Got a little less than 2 minutes. For the audience, for the folks that's watching us as we sit here on this conversation, what can they do and how can they get involved to try to move the needle somewhat on this education funding?
I mean, discussions are going on right now, so it's important for people to contact the governor's office and let them know they want this problem solved.
Okay.
Their support more education funding. Contact your legislators, and It's easy to go on the legislative website or the governor's website and send an email.
Okay.
It just takes a minute to do, and they pay attention to that stuff. A big part of the reason there are these discussions is because there's been a public outcry about this. You know, parents have kids now in classes with 30 to 40 kids in
yeah.
them. That's just not tolerable.
All right, you've heard your marching orders. Get to us and do it. Tim, we got to go. Thank you so much for coming and sharing this information with us.
Thank you, George.
And I'm George Dean, President and CEO of the Greater Phoenix Urban League, and we'll talk with you next month on Urban Connections.